between 4:30 and 5 Eastern Daylight Time. That's about 4 minutes away if it's read earlier on. We're also told that 20 minutes after the court leaves its courtroom that there'll be a presser by Attorney General Keith Ellison. I also have to give you one other thing, a disclaimer. You know, my name is Linda Kenny Bodden. My husband, Dr. Michael Bodden, did the second autopsy for the George Floyd family on Mr. Floyd as to cause of death. He has no part in this trial, as you can see, with the experts that testified, however. So with that, let me go to my one guest first, Judge Brandon Birmingham. We know that what Mr. Nelson said was that his experts said that the testing for CO, carbon monoxide, was not done. But we also know that it was done, and it just wasn't turned over from the hospital to the medical examiner to the prosecutors. Is there something wrong in the system that the jury can't know the truth, especially on a point that's been made about cause of death?
It falls back to the idea that the law is very much a procedure, sometimes at the expense of the actual truth in a given trial. I mean, you take, for example, evidence that is ruled inadmissible because of some evidentiary rule or perhaps even a constitutional violation. It doesn't have anything to do with whether it's true or not. It has to do with whether or not the law, the process that is the law, has been followed. So that's not something unusual, maybe counterintuitive. I would say that most people want to make sure that we get at the truth in a particular case. And I think as long as you realize that it is a well-regulated search for the truth, then you can begin to understand why the rulings are what they are.
And Judge, that's why I tell people when we teach it that there are the four corners of the courtroom, and truth in that courtroom is in those four corners. We don't hear any truth that may be outside the four corners, and when you try a case, you always have to remember that, and we take a verdict, you always have to remember that. Well, let's listen to our own Anjanette Levy, who put together a report for us about this whole issue of whether or not carbon monoxide could have caused the death of George Floyd, or whether or not it could have even hurt the defense. That's something I'll discuss with Nima on the other side of this report.
This argument was all about carbon monoxide and whether or not there was enough of it in George Floyd's blood to contribute to his death.
If he even hints that there are test results that the jury has not heard about, it's going to be a mistrial.
A stern warning from Judge Cahill to prosecutors after they announced they plan to call breathing expert Dr. Martin Tobin back to the stand to rebut claims from a defense expert that said carbon monoxide from a police cruiser exhaust system could have killed George Floyd.
Dr. Fowler was pretty clear. He was not saying that this was the cause of death. He's simply opining that it wasn't considered by the state. And apparently it was considered to be a ridiculous concept by the state of Minnesota that they didn't think to test it.
Dr. David Fowler told jurors Floyd's carbon monoxide levels should have been tested. Now prosecutors say they have those test results.
It was discovered yesterday by Dr. Baker.
Special prosecutor Jerry Blackwell said Baker reached out to them after hearing Fowler's testimony. Judge Cahill called the late disclosure prejudicial to the defense.
It's just by serendipity that Dr. Baker calls the state and says, oh, by the way, it does exist. It should be in there. It seems to me very odd. I'm not claiming any bad faith on the state's part.
Cahill allowed Dr. Tobin to return to the stand to testify about test results the jury had actually seen.
If the hemoglobin is saturated at 98%, it tells you all there was for everything else is 2%, and so the maximum amount of carbon monoxide would be 2%.
Tobin says 2% would be in the normal range.
Dr. Tobin testified that the knee on George Floyd's neck actually cut off his airway, which led to oxygen not being able to get to his brain, while Dr. Fowler testified that the knee on George Floyd's neck did not cause his death. For the Law and Crime Network, I'm Anjanette Levy.
So before I bring my guest Nima Rahmani in to discuss that, I just want to show you the photograph, the picture, the live feed that we are getting outside the Hennepin County Courthouse. As you recall, when Brian Buckmeyer a few hours ago did his conversation with us, it was him, Brian, and the camera. And then we just saw Brian just a few minutes ago, and there were a few people. I called them friends of Brian. Now we have people who have gotten word that there is a verdict, that it will be read hopefully within the next half an hour. And you see people with bullhorns out there. Some are holding Black Lives Matter signs. Others are there just to see what happened. There's from various different agencies, social justice agencies, civil rights agencies who have gathered, and people who are interested in what this verdict will be, what this jury who has been sequestered overnight will find as to whether or not the state proved its burden of whether a crime was committed. As Derek Chauvin, did he murder George Floyd? Did he commit an assault on George Floyd? Did he commit an aggravated manslaughter on George Floyd? Did he commit a manslaughter on George Floyd, an aggravated murder? We don't know what the jury's side. You see the sign there, Justice for George Floyd. So we're going to be continuing monitoring this. I also am monitoring the courtroom feed. I can see that there's a seal of the state of Minnesota up, which means the judge will be entering soon, and we do expect that verdict to be read soon in this matter, and then we'll talk about it, obviously. But in the meantime, Nima Rahmani, the defense advanced this argument, and that we know from the other testing was not true, that carbon monoxide could have been a cause of death of George Floyd. And then later the experts said, I'm just saying they didn't test for it. The prosecution brought back in rock star witness Dr. Tobin, who said, look, he had a blood oxygen level from the gases taken as risk when he entered the emergency room of 98%. So therefore, it couldn't have been a carbon monoxide feed. Did the defense shoot themselves in their foot by advancing such a ridiculous thing that the tailpipe of the car killed George Floyd?
Linda, it wasn't the best argument, but the defense had to pull out all the stops in this case. And it was surprising because it's not something that Nelson raised during opening statement. He talked about the tumor, he talked about the arteries, he talked about the enlarged heart, but he didn't talk about the carbon monoxide poisoning argument. That's something that first came up with Dr. Fowler. And prosecution did many things right in this case, but one of the things they did wrong was not turning over that report. And then Judge Cahill made it clear that if they discussed the contents of that report, he would declare a mistrial. But what the prosecution did do right, and this is that chess game that we always talk about, and that rock star witness, Dr. Tobin, was able to talk about the report that they did have, the oxygen level report, that 98%. So he was able to make the same argument by analogy, saying the oxygen level was 98%. That means at most it would have been 2% carbon dioxide. So they were able to overcome it. I understand what the defense did, what they did. They had to do it. But I love what Dr. Tobin did to rebut that. And I think that's one of the reasons they're going to get a guilty verdict in this case, because of that witness.
And Nima, I'd like you and Judge Brandon Birmingham to watch with me now some of the rebuttal argument of prosecutor Jerry Blackwell. Now, just note that one of the things that Attorney General Keith Ellison did here is he hired pro bono 2 civil lawyers who one had been a former prosecutor, U.S. attorney like yourself, Nima, that would be Stephen Slisher, to really take the laboring oars in this case. And if he does win this case, he'll be given a lot of credit, and if he loses it, obviously he'll be given a lot of blame. But let's listen to one of those, and that's Jerry Blackwell, who opened this jury. Let's listen to a portion of his rebuttal closing argument.
May 25th, that tiny little speck of a dot, and not even that whole day. Because as we know, there was a 10-minute segment, 9 minutes and 29 seconds. You analyze them and against the facts and the evidence that you've heard, you'll see what I mean. Take, for example, the notion that Mr. Floyd dying of cardiopulmonary arrest, dying from low oxygen, was just coincidental. He just happened to die at the same time, in the same place, of factors completely unrelated to what Mr. Chauvin was doing with his subdual, restraint, and neck compression. That's a story, ladies and gentlemen, and defies common sense. I'll show you what I mean. Oh, sorry, Your Honor. Yeah. So if we just treat each day that Mr. Floyd lived, he was born October 14th, 1973, and just made it a dot on a page. And we looked at over his lifetime. You'll see here, if we look over 10 years, 20, 30, 40 years, up to May 25th of 2020, that means that Mr. Floyd would have lived up to that day 17,026 days. Now, only one of these dots corresponds to May 25th. Only one of them. All the rest of these days, all the rest of these dots represent days that Mr. Floyd was living. He was breathing. He had a being. He was living. He was breathing and had a being with every single disorder that Mr. Nelson has chronicled. Each and every day. You know, with his struggles with opioid addiction, with his high blood pressure, etc. Every single day, except the one day. May 25th, that tiny little speck of a dot, and not even that whole day. Because as we know, there was a 10-minute segment, 9 minutes and 29 seconds, that he didn't survive. So in one day's time, there are 144 of those, 10-minute segments. And only one of them was the reason that Mr. Floyd failed to survive. And what happened in that space? Well, you know what happened. Ladies and gentlemen, that's where there was deadly force applied by Mr. Chauvin. We know it was deadly force because we heard from Officer Zimmerman on the stand, who told us it was deadly force. He said it's deadly force because it's force capable of killing a person, which makes it deadly force. Now, deadly force, ladies and gentlemen, once you see what Mr. Floyd was subjected to with this deadly force in the prone position, there are certain consequences or the risks that come with the prone position and the use of this kind of deadly force. And that primary risk is it affects your breathing. You heard that from witness after witness after witness. It affects your breathing, makes it harder to breathe. You put the subject into the prone recovery position as soon as possible because you don't want to affect their breathing, low oxygen. Do you have evidence of low oxygen here? There is evidence of low oxygen, ladies and gentlemen, that is medically unassailable, medically.
Judge Brandon Birmingham, we are looking at the seal of the courtroom. As you know, there will be a pool reporter that will be allowed in there. The jury will be in there, obviously the prosecutors, and obviously the defendant and his attorney. But let me just jump to the chase. Let me go further. We all know at the end of this closing, rebuttal closing, Prosecutor Jerry Blackwell, special prosecutor, said, even though he didn't understand that you shouldn't say shading the truth, did say something to the effect, you were told Mr. Floyd died because his heart was too big. The reason George Floyd is dead is because Mr. Chauvin's heart was too small. Tell me, sir, is this the new Johnny Cochran line that we're going to hear from now on? If the glove doesn't fit, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Or is this even a better line?
I think it's really hard to compete with Johnny Cochran, but I just absolutely love that demonstrative aid that he used. To bring things like that for the jury is so powerful in a courtroom, whether it's a nice tagline like Johnny Cochran's or all of these circles representing all the days in his lives that he lived and didn't die. And it was the one day, this one 10-minute period. I bet that was a very powerful thing to bring home for all those jurors. Very memorable. You might see that more often than you hear the quote.
And let me just go to Nima on this. Nima, Jerry Blackwell was very laid back, probably more laid back than we from New York City, New Jersey, maybe from California would be. But this is a Minnesota jury. This is his jury. This is his area, okay? Did some of the themes that they started, Stephen Slisher started his opening talking about George Floyd, and Derek Chauvin didn't have compassion. Was this woven together before they even tried this case to have the theme compassion, small heart, let up or get up, he knew better, he didn't do better? Tell me how that works to get these kind of statements into closings.
Yes, Linda, and dare I say that Blackwell was Johnny Cochran-esque, no question. From the jump, the prosecution told a great story. They told a story about Chauvin's pride and ego that caused him not to relent, not to let up, not to relieve or adjust the pressure on George Floyd's neck. And from the beginning, I love Blackwell's analogy from opening. Let's not forget, believe your eyes. This is homicide. And the quote he used in closing, that there is no excuse for police abuse. Absolutely love both of those. And the way he ended, I certainly will not forget the discussion of George George Floyd's large heart, but really this is a case about Derek Chauvin's small heart, and that's the reason George Floyd's dead. Absolutely love that. Highly effective rebuttal. And I know defense attorneys don't like it when prosecutors sandbag, but clearly they had that demonstrative ready to go, and they had some of their best arguments, some of their best analogies, some of their best sayings ready for rebuttal, and they really struck those points home with the jury.
Yeah, 17,026 days George Floyd lived, and then on the fateful day he met Derek Chauvin, and all of a sudden he stopped breathing. It was not coincidental, said the prosecutors. Well, Eric Nelson before that had a closing also, and he has a duty, ladies and gentlemen, to represent his client to the best available means. We in this country and internationally gave the Nuremberg trial, the Nazis who killed all the Jewish population in the ovens. And you know, crime of the century, Winston Churchill said there were no words for the dehumanizing unhumanity of that, okay? So, but we led the way to give them a fair trial. So let's be sure, we want to have due process. Everyone gets a fair trial. And Eric Nelson did this case from beginning to end by himself in that courtroom with that jury. Let's listen to an argument he had about perception here. And it was actually perception versus perspective. It's quite an interesting argument. Let's listen.
Genevieve Hansen, right? 27-year-old female firefighter for the city of Minneapolis. She testified that when she walked into the scene, she described the crowd as upset. She said, I walked into an upset crowd. She said that the other voices distracted me from getting the officer's attention. And she testified, again, based on her perspective, that Officer Chauvin appeared to have his hand in his pocket. She observed what she believed to be blood on the from Mr. Floyd's face being pressed into the pavement. She observed fluid coming from Mr. Floyd's body that she presumed to be urine. She testified that nobody ever told her that EMS or an ambulance was on the way. She asked about, when I asked her about the response time she would have expected, 3 minutes. When I told her that paramedics had been called about 5 minutes prior to her arriving on scene, no way, because her perception is 3 minutes. But when you look at the things that Ms. Hansen saw, whether it be from her perspective or her perception, there can always be more to the story. The blood coming from Mr. Floyd's nose was why they called EMS in the first place. You've seen the pictures. He injured his nose during the struggle, or his face during the struggle in the squad car. The fluid that she described as potentially being urine, we know that that's fluid coming from the underside carriage of the squad car.
I cannot breathe.
Officer Chauvin specifically told her an ambulance was coming when she first came on scene.
Don't come over here. Don't come over here.
Off on the sidewalk.
Yeah, we need you to keep some distance. Yeah, the ambulance coming.
Yep, we got an ambulance coming.
Okay. While we wait for this verdict, and I have to tell you, don't change wherever you're on, because Law&Crime Network will go into the courtroom. You see the seal. We will carry it live, even if we have to interrupt people like Judge Brandon Birmingham, who I want to discuss this whole argument of perception versus perspective on. Judge, one of the things that the firefighter, though, said, Genevieve Hansen, when pressed about this, she said, as to her memory and maybe her perspective or her perception, that's why I videotaped it. Does that do away with this argument?
I don't know if it necessarily just does away with the argument, but I do like the way that Mr. Nelson was framing the issue for jurors. We talked about that those jury instructions, how long and how arduous they were. But when you can properly frame the issue as a lawyer, then you've gone a long way to convincing somebody that your point is right, because once you frame it the way you want, then you've already won the argument, because you're only going to give facts that are going to support the way that you frame the issue. So that part was really good. On the other side, though, yes, what they see may conflict with what he's saying, and I think that is why that video was so powerful. And also the intuition from the fireman. This is something that's happening. This is something that's wrong. This is something that I'm not going to stop, but I want everybody to know and understand what's happening because it conflicts with my intuitions about right and wrong. I think that's a very powerful statement that she gave.
And Nima, I always tell people when I teach, and jury consultants will obviously tell lawyers who haven't used them before, that when you do a closing and you give a closing, what you are doing is giving little tidbits, little grains, little pieces of fact, little arguments to the people that you think are your people's, quote unquote, on the jury, who you've picked purposely because they will go into that jury room and you think fight for your side of the story. So now you're giving them the ammunition, if you will. Did Mr. Nelson give people that would side with the fact that maybe this police officer didn't wake up that day intending to kill anybody, the ammunition to find him not guilty, or at least not guilty of the top counts?
Apparently not, Linda. I respect Eric. He did his absolute best with the hand that he was dealt, but this was a very tough case. And he tried to focus on the drugs. He tried to focus on Derek Chauvin's perspective or perception, the limited information he had about an unruly suspect who was large, who 2 rookie police officers were unable to subdue and handcuff. But unfortunately, I don't think it was enough for this jury. I don't think he was able to provide enough arguments, like you said, because that's really what you do. You want to empower your jurors to go in that deliberation room and to fight for you. And I don't think he was able to do enough with the evidence in this case to get those 1 or 2 holdout jurors that he needed. But we'll see very soon.
Okay, so Judge Birmingham, let me go to the fact that this defendant here is a police officer, and as we know, Prosecutor Slisher and Mr. Blackwell said this is a pro-police prosecution, not a bad police prosecution. Again, we know that Derek Chauvin didn't wake up, no matter what you think of that, and I don't think even the prosecutors would say he woke up that morning, I'm going to go kill somebody, and it's going to be, just happened to be George Floyd, but he did, okay? We also know that he has a number of charges that were in his disciplinary file that were unfounded or not founded. And many times people question that, right? How could you have like 18 or 20 charges or 19 charges and they're all unfounded? Is there a problem with the police policing themselves? If indeed some of those charges were true and but were found unfounded, could we help police officers more by really keeping them on the straight and narrow in terms of disciplining them or retraining them or reteaching them so they don't get into the situation where they're on trial for murder?
I would love to see that in the future. And as far as whether or not the police are policing themselves, or there's even been calls for prosecution offices, DA's offices who have cases like this where they're working hand in hand with the department to bring in somebody else to actually try the case. And we have that sort of going on here in Minnesota. I think that anytime that you have the appearance of impropriety when you're trying to get at the truth in a particular situation, whether it's investigating alleged misconduct by a police officer or whether it's the well-regulated search for the truth that we've been talking about this afternoon, the appearance of impropriety, the appearance of bias should be eliminated to the extent possible.
All right, and that well-regulated search for the truth, Judge, I may have to adopt that in some form. Nima, if this case is not guilty, we know that there are 3 other officers who are going to be tried in August. One of the officers, Officer Tao, was actually kind of like running, shall we say, shotgun and putting everybody away, not listening to Genevieve Hansen, according to her. Then we have the 2 other officers, one who had a portion of his body on George Floyd's leg, another one who had a portion of his body on George Floyd's back, all of which the state is contending contributed, aided and abetted each other to making it that George Floyd couldn't breathe. The restraint on the neck, the restraint on the back, and the restraint on the leg, so he could not get up to breathe. If this is a guilty in any of the counts, what does that bode for the other officers?
It bodes well for the state, and it's bad for those other officers, Lang, Tao, and Chung, because they're charged with the aiding and abetting the second-degree manslaughter. So even if you get down to that bottom count, that second-degree manslaughter, that's sufficient for the state to go after those officers, and believe me, they will. Now, obviously, in the unlikely event that there's a not guilty verdict, I don't believe the prosecution of those 3 other officers can continue based on that aiding and abetting alone, which is insufficient if there is a not guilty verdict in the Derek Chauvin case.
And we're seeing the seal, that courtroom, as soon as the judge goes in there, we'll go to it, and we're seeing also the view outside the courthouse as indeed the crowds are growing. Nima, let me ask you this, though. All right, so you have the other officers. Are you surprised that no deal was made with them to bring them in to discuss maybe conversations that occurred or what they were told? Or is it just that they couldn't give information, or is this too high-profile case involving that 9-minute and 29-second video that you just didn't want to offer them a deal?
Linda, you hit the nail on the head. There's 2 reasons why they didn't receive any type of deal. First, the evidence speaks for itself. The state and the prosecution, they had that body cam footage. They had the bystander video. They didn't need the officers to testify. They weren't going to add anything in terms of evidence. And the other, there's just way too much political pressure to cut a deal in this case. Let's not forget, Derek Chauvin was willing to plead to a manslaughter deal, and Attorney General Bill Barr rejected that deal. One of the things that folks have forgotten about and they haven't really talked about, but Chauvin was willing to take a deal and serve up to 10 years. But even the Attorney General of the United States thought that it was politically inappropriate to offer that type of deal. And the reason the Attorney General was involved, let's not forget, part of Chauvin's deal would be that he served time in federal prison and that he not be charged with federal civil rights violations. So the Attorney General had to sign off.
And so those could still be up in the air. Judge, let me ask you this as we're looking at more and more people gathering, awaiting what they hope will be their version of the march to justice, the achievement of justice here. Let me just ask you this. The schools are going to remote learning in the county or in the area because they thought the verdict would be either tomorrow to Friday. Is that because of security concerns? Is that because that some schools and some students are already walking out because they want to be involved in social justice issues? Or is there some other concern that would lead to this? Is it safety motivated? Is it the fact that the students want to be involved? Is it the fact that, for instance, I was teaching a course at Harvard, the TALL course, when the Capitol riots happened and we had to, dismiss everything because all of us wanted to see what was happening. So what drives that kind of shutdown?
I would suspect that at top of mind is safety. And, as I'm watching all of the people crowd around, I can't help but just I'm a little nervous to see what's going to happen when you have a large group of people like that. That's, sometimes a recipe for disaster. Perhaps that's what it is. Maybe it's a manpower issue as well. That you've got to redirect some of your resources in order to deal with any problems that may come up. And, if something does happen, then I would want my children to be at home. So I bet it's probably because of safety.
That's interesting, Nima. But aren't we? Let's ask this: if there is a not guilty verdict, there'll be arguments that this process needs to be blown up. Okay, and there's many who agree with that. That the courts aren't working because our own eyes saw the video. On the other hand, as lawyers, we know that this was a due process and the judge ran a great trial here and pretty much let the attorneys, both of them, try their cases. So how do we resolve it if this is a not guilty and the end result is some kind of mass protest that erupts in uncontrolled behavior and violence?
First, I have to give a shout out to my University, Harvard, and if you're a current student there, definitely take Linda's class. With respect to a not guilty verdict, unfortunately, law enforcement was woefully unprepared last summer for the protests or the riots, depending on what side of the spectrum you're on. I think this time around, law enforcement, there's going to be a lot of pressure on them to not allow the property damage, the injuries that happened in the summer of 2020 to happen again. So they're going to do everything necessary to prepare themselves this time to atone for the mistakes of last summer. With respect to a potential not guilty verdict, obviously as lawyers and Judge Birmingham as a judge, we are all big believers in our system of justice. I disagree with Representative Maxine Waters I encourage everyone to respect the jury's decision. They were in the courtroom every single day, listening to the evidence, listening to the witnesses. Our criminal system of justice works. I know people were upset about Rodney King. That was a long time ago. That was close by here in California in Simi Valley, but that was almost an all-white jury. And let's not forget, even in that case, those officers were retried and 2 of the 4 were convicted in the subsequent federal case. So our system of justice works, folks. Believe in it. It's the best system that we have and much better than we have in other countries.
And we could see that here. We could see a federal prosecution judge. And I say that because when the medical examiner, Dr. Baker, was on the stand, he said he was interviewed by the FBI and he's testified before the grand jury 2 times. One last August, and apparently nothing resulted. And one, I think people missed it, just in February of this year, February 2021, pandemic time, okay? So that means there is a federal investigation going on that may involve this incident and maybe even larger areas of the MPD, who knows? But should we take heart in the fact that there is this 2-tiered system, that if one fails, maybe the other steps in?
Well, I don't think that they're set up to be fail-safes or backstops or something like that. Each system has its own interests, its own laws, and if a law is violated, then they have every right, as whoever it is in charge of that particular system has every right to go forward and prosecute, and they should do so zealously and truthfully, based on facts and evidence and nothing else. So I think that that's a reason or a way to consider whether or not federal should go forward for state. And it sounds too like I need to apologize to you and Mr. Ramani on behalf of South Texas College of Law. I'm sorry that you guys couldn't get in and have to settle on Harvard.
Thank you. I actually went to my state university, Rutgers. You know, I'm a New Jersey girl, and I love everything New Jersey. Okay, Nima Ramani, though, let's talk about something else happened. Again, this trial is not in the abstract, okay? It is the trial involving Derek Chauvin. Could the state specifically prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there was a crime committed in the death of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin? But there's also surrounding cases, surrounding social justice issues. How did the case of the shooting of Daunte Wright, or the 13-year-old young child, I should say, Eric Toledo in Chicago, who was shot after he did have a gun, but he was told to drop it. He did. He put his hands up, and he was shot. How do those cases where they're being discussed, where they're being protested against, where the legal system has to deal with it and get it right, how do they affect this George Floyd discussion, this Derek Chauvin discussion?
And in theory, they shouldn't, but in practice, they absolutely do. The jurors are human beings. They're not robots. They aren't immune to these types of societal pressures. Everyone is on social media. Everyone is talking about Daunte Wright, how this could possibly happen where an officer can discharge a firearm instead of a taser, and how this has happened twice before in other states. And unfortunately, in the case of the 13-year-old who was shot after maybe allegedly discarding a firearm, and there was at least some time allegedly after that firearm was no longer in his hand and he was shot. Very tragic case involving a child. So it's impossible for jurors not to be affected by other police killings like these.
Okay, so Judge, if this happened in your jurisdiction and there was a representative called Earth, Sun, and Sky who discussed civil rights issues, would you obviously be concerned? Would you mention it, or would you just say, hey, defense, you have to make your proofs and I will rule on it later?
I would be I guard very heavily the sanctity and the integrity of the entire process. If you notice what Judge Cahill said was sort of along the lines, he hoped that they wouldn't say anything because, as a trial judge, you have limited powers on what you can command and what you can enforce, and then what you hope. If I knew the representative, I might say, hey, man, chill out. We don't need to have you talking about all this kind of stuff. Let the process play out, as Mr. Ramani talked about, because we're all believers in it. So you try to do everything that you can within the bounds of your power to maintain the integrity. Now, on the other side, maybe you can't control what's happening on the outside, but you can control what's happening on the inside. And that's why you have rules that allow me to take, as the court, cell phones away. I did that, and I've done that before on other trials, and give them to me now. You get them at the end of the trial, but you won't have them before then, and sequestration rules and all those things to maintain that integrity.
That's really interesting, because I would imagine that even someone like you sometimes gets frustrated with things that happen that you have no control over when you're trying to make sure that whatever the verdict is, that it's sanctified, that it's justified, that it's upheld. Because isn't that the ball game, Judge?
Well, it sure is. And that relationship between the judge and the jurors, I think, is very important. I know that I underestimated that before I became a judge. And they do look to you for guidance. And I think if you are the judge, you can continue to refer to the promises that you make, continue to protect them, let them have faith in you, and to let them do their job. And if they can trust you, I think they're much more likely to follow all of your instructions.
And Nima, former federal prosecutor, we see on one of our CGIs, one of our chyrons, that indeed the jury did deliberate around 10 hours. And we discussed it before, that a sequestered jury comes in usually a little earlier because they don't have that, those things, those distractions. You got to take a break every few minutes, and you have to do this and you have to do that. But let's talk about something more important in this case. That is not only the fact that, as you once put it, we are all, with our cell phone cameras, we can all be almost reporters, loggers of the system. But here the police were wearing what they call body-worn cameras. In some states it's called just body cameras. We saw Stephen Schlisser present all the officers' body cameras of that day. How important is it now that all jurisdictions wear body cameras so that the truth is recorded from the officer's perspective?
It's extremely important, Linda. I don't understand jurisdictions that don't mandate body-worn cameras for police officers. And I know we've talked about it a lot, but frankly, if it wasn't for the video evidence in this case, both the officer testimony, both the officer videos and the bystander videos, I'm not even sure that we would be looking at second-degree murder charges in this case. That's how powerful and important that evidence is. And it's critical to hold police officers accountable for any misconduct.
Nima, let me ask you the follow-up to that. Would we be looking at any charges if we did not have the bystanders' videos, especially the one from the minor child who recorded this, the 9-minute and 29-second video?
We may not, Linda. We may not have any charges, and we certainly wouldn't have murder charges in this case. It may have just been manslaughter or nothing at all. That's how critical this evidence was.
And Judge, all right, so in your jurisdiction, Dallas, do the police wear body-worn cameras?
Yes, they do, and I'm so glad that they do.
Oops, you know what? We have to go, Judge. We have to go into court. Judge Peter Cahill is on the bench. The verdict's about to be read. Let's go. We just saw the jury return their verdict guilty on all 3 counts, guilty on the second-degree murder, guilty on the third-degree murder, guilty on the second-degree manslaughter, showing that the prosecutors, the state of Minnesota, has proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt to all 12 jurors. Let me chat with my guest about this. Judge Birmingham, in a way, I'm choked up. The way Judge Cahill, obviously doing what he does best, okay? The way he does what he does best, which is get in there, read the verdicts, and then get out. You know what? We're going to go outside, Judge, and listen to what's happening outside in the Hennepin County Courthouse. Let's listen. This is the crowd outside the Hennepin County Courthouse, where Derek Chauvin has just been found guilty by a jury of his peers on all 3 counts 2 counts of murder, 1 count of manslaughter for killing George Floyd last May 2020. The justice system worked pretty fast in this case. They revoked Derek Chauvin's bail. You saw him. He was taken away in handcuffs. Much of the handcuffs like we saw when George Floyd was on the ground beside that police car. The verdict read by the jury foreman who had been voted on by the other jurors. He was, as the judge said, P19. That would have been prospective juror at that time, 19. Let me just tell you, he was a white man in his 30s, and he has a friend that is an MPD canine officer. He has a friend that is in the MPD police department. He was one of the jurors. He has also served on a jury before 5 years ago, but was an alternate. He saw portions of the video. He had an impression of Chauvin that was so negative because someone died, and that's obviously not a positive thing. However, he said he had not formed an opinion before he heard the evidence. He did not examine the evidence from the viewpoint of the law, and that he believed both sides need to be heard, but added, quote, George didn't get that chance. That was the foreman who read the verdict of guilty, guilty, and guilty. Judge Peter Cahill dispatching the jury verdict really quickly, dispatching the motion, revoking the bail of Derek Chauvin. Well, he will go directly to jail. Do not pass go. As you note, he was there. He didn't have much emotion that we could see because he was wearing a mask. His attorney, Eric Nelson, seated beside him in the courtroom, Derek Chauvin, for the first time, actually had lightened up wearing a white shirt for this reading of the jury verdict, which occurred in about 10 hours of deliberation over 10 days. So we're seeing outside Black Lives Matter. We're seeing people that gathered to share in the verdict, whatever it was. And I would suggest that the justice system worked not only well, it worked very well in this case. Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, has to be proud that his decision to not only take over this case and also his decision to bring the charges of second-degree murder when everyone was talking only about third-degree murder, and his decision to bring on Stephen Slisher and Jerry Blackwell from the outside, private attorneys who had other experience and worked with the office, Matthew Frank, and other prosecutors, obviously has been vindicated in getting a conviction on the top count as the prosecutors would look at it. Again, the jury has found that Derek Chauvin, a Minnesota Police Department officer, Minneapolis Police Department officer, was guilty on the top count, guilty on the second count of murder, and guilty on the third count involving manslaughter. Judge Brandon Birmingham from Dallas, Texas, I was going to you before we were so interrupted with Judge Cahill going on the bench. Judge Cahill just handled this like he handled everything in the courtroom. There's business. It's going to be done. It's going to be done within the law. I'm not going to waste time. I'm not going to waste discussion on things. In and out. Your initial reaction, sir.
Well, Judge Cahill did a very amazing thing, and I'm sure there was a whole lot of preparation that went into that. But yes, there's no need to engage in fanfare and all that. You read the verdict, you go forward. But let me just say that I'm take a step back for just a minute and just say that one of the things that I'm most proud about this particular case is not an outcome. It's just the fact that it seems to have been a result that was reached because of the law and the evidence, and not because of anything else outside of that courtroom. The evidence was overwhelming. The video proves what it proves. It speaks for itself, and the verdict was based on that and not anything else. And that means to me that the system worked.
And Nima, and we're seeing pictures outside the Hennepin County Courthouse. By the way, every floor has been evacuated prior. The only thing that was going on in that courthouse was this trial handled by this judge during this pandemic with this jury who was willing to serve. Nima, we didn't even lose a juror in this trial, not one, and we were all so concerned about that. But you had been right. You predicted from day one when I had you on the air with me, before we even selected the jury, that this was going to be a guilty down the road, all the way down that verdict sheet, and you were right. Your thoughts, sir?
I know Judge Cahill was all business, but for me, this trial was personal. Maybe because I've spent so much time with you, Linda, over the past several months now, discussing this trial, covering this trial, everything from jury selection to the guilty verdict that was read today. But our criminal system works. Our jury system works. And I tip my hat to Keith Ellison, the first Muslim American to serve in Congress, now the Minnesota Attorney General, for bringing this case, bringing these charges. We know how difficult it is to charge officers with murder in this country. We know how difficult it is for juries to return guilty verdicts on those murder counts. And he was able to accomplish what a lot of others haven't done. I commend this jury of half white men and women, half African Americans and people of color, for doing the right thing, for making the hard decision. And I commend the public for being patient over the past several weeks as the jury did their job, and they did a fine job. So, you know, my parents were immigrants to this country, and when I talk to my children today as they return to elementary school, we can close this really dark chapter in America's history. This happened at the beginning of quarantine. Now things are reopening, and really justice was served, and I'm proud to be an American today, as we all should be.
And also, I think we have to give a shout out to the young woman who testified, who took that video when the cops were looking at her. I don't know if I would have had the fortitude to take that bystander pedestrian video. Let's go to Brian Buckmeyer. Brian, you were on the ground. You were in the middle of it. What is happening, sir?
So, Linda, as you can see, I am surrounded by people of all walks of life. Let me take this off so you can see. And we're seeing a number of people here just cheering. And I think there's also the recognition that this is the start of justice. There seems to be a tide that is turning where police officers can be found guilty of crimes that we all see. I think the prosecution's words of the video is the proof, and everyone saw that proof, and that's what they're chanting, that's what they're cheering, especially when this verdict came out.
And Brian, is the crowd growing there? And do you see a sense of relief with the cheering?
Absolutely. I think it was very evident that everyone was kind of holding their collective breath as Judge Cahill came out. There were people on their phones, having their laptops out, seeing him come out, and then just waiting for especially that first and top count. And as he read through it, CR dash all of the points, and got to the final point of the verdict and said guilty, you heard cheers for the first count, cheers for the second count, cheers for the third count, and they continued. Seems very much like a party atmosphere. I'm seeing some going on in the corner. I'm seeing people chanting and cheering. There seems to be a level of rejoicing here that everyone seems to be in high spirits right now.
Brian, let's talk about several things. The tragic rock star video, as I call it, but also let's talk about this jury who during the pandemic came in from all walks of life. You had younger, you had older, you had mixed race, you had black, you had white, and they came to a verdict without even asking one question. They knew what they wanted to do together, didn't they?
Absolutely. It's at least considering the volume of evidence, the number of witnesses, and also to some extent the confusion of how the charges are written out. Because Linda, you and I went to school to learn the law, to practice the law. You and I practiced for some years understanding how charges are read, understanding how crimes can be committed based on the elements. But no one goes to jury school to learn how to do this. And the speed by which the jury came to this decision without any notes is, I think, a testament to how well they were focused in this trial, taking notes, paying attention, and seeing the elements, the charges, and some of the doubt that wasn't reasonable in this case.
And that had to be sewn or wrapped up by the presentation of the prosecutors. Isn't that correct, Brian? That perhaps that Stephen Slisher, who really is, in my opinion, one of the stars of this trial in terms of making complicated law see easy. What is your view, Brian?
I think that everyone's going to find a star in this case, whether it be Slisher or Blackwell or some of the witnesses. But I think whoever your star witness or star prosecutor was in this case, the prosecution carried their burden. He was found guilty of all counts. The next, and I think the major step now, is what's the sentencing going to look like?
Brian, thank you very much. We know the sentencing will be about 8 weeks from now, and the pre-sentence report will be about 6 weeks from now, and then the defense obviously will have a chance to respond to whatever the pre-sentencing procedures are and the findings are in that report. Thank you very much, Brian. I know you're going to go back to seeing what you can see and learning what you can learn and finding that little niche that no other reporter has except for the Law and Crime Network. I'll talk to you soon, sir.
Bye.
And let me talk to my guests now, Judge Brandon Birmingham and Nima Rahmani. Judge Birmingham, there was a moment in this trial, we were discussing body-worn cams, where Stephen Slisher was presenting what we all thought was just going to be the custodian of the body cam records. It was at the end of the day. I remember I was on the air. I think Nima may have been on the air also. And then we saw the 4 body-worn cams that we had never seen in unison together. And I know I do this kind of work. I see this stuff all the time. I didn't want to see it anymore. I felt like I needed to have therapy. What about this jury serve? You've been in a situation where the jurors have ever come back and said, look, we did our job, but now we need some help.
Absolutely. You know, we deal with some very, very heavy stuff whenever we're trying these felony cases. And in Texas, we do have mechanisms, and I'm hopeful that all states have this, for jurors to have some resources that are available to them should they want it, to talk with somebody and work out some of this stuff, because you see things in a courtroom that, basically people should never see. And so it is tough for the jurors to deal with.
Yeah, and Nima, let me just go to you on this situation. We know that I know your opinion that the video was obviously the most important piece of evidence. But that doesn't mean much if you don't have a prosecutor willing to bring it. And this case started out, if I recall, by the county attorney saying that there was no evidence that George Floyd died as a result of his interaction with Derek Chauvin, but it was more likely drugs. And somehow it then did a number of turns. What happened, Nima, that we get here with Keith Ellison, who brings this successful prosecution to validate what we all thought we saw on the videotape?
Linda, we have a problem with local prosecutors in this country. They're elected officials. They're afraid to lose, and they're afraid to make the tough charging decisions. We saw it with Ahmaud Arbery down there in Georgia, where multiple county prosecutors chose not to bring charges until the attorney general got involved. And a different situation here in Minnesota, but again, I can't give enough credit to Attorney General Ellison and the decision to charge Derek Chauvin, knowing how difficult it is. And hopefully, with verdicts like this, prosecutors will be more empowered to make the tough charging decisions, knowing that it's not easy to prosecute a police officer like someone with significant criminal history, but it's the right thing to do, and hopefully things change.
And Judge Birmingham, you obviously were the judge where a police officer was convicted. You know what, Judge? Can you hold that for a second? Let's go on the ground outside the courthouse. We have something very special that the Law and Crime Network has. That's our own Anjanette Levy and Maurice Hall, who was supposedly a witness in this case, but you saw him on the videotape. He was there the day George Floyd died. Anjanette.
Yes. Linda, good afternoon to you, or good evening on the East Coast. I'm here with Maurice Hall. He was in the vehicle with George Floyd the night that this happened, during the incident inside Cup Foods. He and Shawanda Hill were there. Maurice was supposed to testify, ended up not doing so. He invoked the Fifth. Maurice, you came down here to the courthouse today. You could have watched this on television. Why did you come down here?
To promote positive, I wanted to make sure that if it was a guilty trial, that I want to promote positive protests and not burn the city down if we could. That was my main motion of really being out here today.
You were there when this happened that night. What was kind of going through your head when you were standing there with Shawanda Hill and Officer Chang, and this was all going on across the street?
Allegedly, I had no thoughts at the time. I was numb. I couldn't. I was being detained. That's like the world saw. I couldn't really have any emotions at that time.
I tried to ask you some questions when we were over by the car, and your people told you not to talk to me about those questions about being in the car. You invoked the Fifth so you wouldn't be testifying. You came down here, though. You could have watched this on television, as I mentioned. So what does this mean to you? There were 3 guilty verdicts. There could have just been 1. There could have been none. There could have been 2. But to have 3 guilty verdicts on 2nd degree, 3rd degree, and then the manslaughter charges, what are your feelings? What was it like when you heard that?
Prosecution done a great job, and it was the right thing to do. We all saw it. We all witnessed it.
Tell me about George Floyd. How long did you know him?
I've been knowing Floyd like 20, 21 years. Floyd was life, full of life. You know, you didn't have to have much to be in his presence and still have fun. You know, he's a sense of humor, great sense of humor guy. He's a giver. You know, most people adders, subtractors, and dividers. Floyd was an adder, definitely. He added to your life, whether it was physical presence and he can help, or just his security, or his words of encouragement, wisdom. You know, like the brother, just an all-around team player, athlete, and that's just what. You know, you didn't have to speak or say anything, and he can know when you're having a bad day. That day and other days prior to it, we were together, and we always have fun with least money, you know. So it's not about what was in his system or anything. Floyd was a great guy. I'm a missing.
How did you guys meet?
Floyd and I met through music, the hip-hop world.
In Texas?
In Texas. He's a part of what they call the Screwed Up Clique, which is a legendary place down in Houston, and he always made underground mixtapes. So he was a part of the culture that I looked up to, and that's a real strong culture where I'm from, and him and I had a chance to experience that, and him being able to be a member was powerful. So once we united in Minneapolis, we never departed. You know, like everything I went through, Floyd knew about it. If I go visit home, he'll have my vehicle and keep watch of them. And if I had a bad time, I was on pillar, I had nowhere to be, I'd be with Floyd at his place. I go to work with him. You know, we just enjoyed each other's company.
You went to the club with him or to the truck driving? You said he drove a truck.
Yeah, he drove trucks. And what I did was we rented a hotel room so we can be closer to the company. But I definitely would go on the weekends to the clubs with him. It was a Latino club, so we didn't really music, but we enjoyed being able to relate with each other, you know.
So you were there at the club with him. Had you ever seen Derek Chauvin?
Minneapolis policemen. I never saw that guy personally, I don't think. But, I mean, I've seen them up there. They're supposed to be up there for the crowd to kind of usher the crowd along and help get them out the streets.
Did you know, do you know if George Floyd, your friend, and Derek Chauvin knew one another from that work at the club?
I do not.
You don't know that? That's been a big question. There have been reports that they did. There have been reports that they didn't because Chauvin worked outside and George worked inside. So is there anything else you'd like to share with us about your feelings on this verdict? Obviously, you were part of this trial in a way. You were brought in.
I'm going to be a part of it for life. I'm going to just take the experience and use it for a positive. Turn such a negative into positive in my life and be a law-abiding citizen today.
I think it's interesting that you came down here to encourage peaceful protest if the verdict didn't go the way the people here in the crowd wanted it to. Why was that important to you?
Well, I feel and making the city look ugly for nothing. They didn't kill Floyd, and it wouldn't certainly bring him back. So I just felt like something God put it on my heart to try to, encourage them not to do so if I could. George had an influence, but he didn't personally. Plus, I knew George wouldn't approve of it. That's the main thing. I know George wouldn't want that.
What are your plans now?
To always now to just carry the story as much as I can positively and, go around telling our story, book writing, whatever else comes along in the future, but definitely represent him and myself in a positive way for the rest.
And you don't want to, you said there were things you can't talk about. I know your representative over here and both your lawyer got a little upset when I tried to ask you some certain questions. But you're just going to move forward and take care of your own things that you've got going on.
Correct. And be a law-abiding citizen mainly, and change my past life and make it into a positive, you know, use it as a support with all the things that's going to come positive off of George losing his life like that. Big Floyd didn't deserve that, so I can just make it something positive.
What about the upcoming trials, the trial of the 3 other officers that will be in late August?
This is a good sign for this one. It's definitely a good sign, so be there.
You're going to be at the trials?
Maybe.
You don't know? Okay. Oh, okay. We'll talk to Ms. Cousins then, I guess. Okay. So you may be getting some immunity for the other trial? Is that what I'm to be led to believe?
We don't know. Who knows?
Can't talk about that. We like breaking news here at Law&Crime, so if your lawyer will let you know, if you want to share anything with us, now's the time.
Long live Big Floyd.
Okay. Well, I did my best. Maurice Hall, thanks so much. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you. Good to meet you. Thank you. Thank you. Right. So that was Maurice Hall commenting on what he might receive in the trial coming up in August. I think that would be really interesting, since they referred me to his attorney, who has yet so far commented. If he received immunity, that would certainly make the next trial very interesting.
And Jeanette, that was just a fabulous interview with Maurice Hall, who took the fifth, and no one has heard from him, but you got the interview for the Law&Crime Network. But let me ask you, you were in the middle out there. What is the atmosphere like, since Mr. Maurice Hall said he's there to promote positive protest, PPP?
Yeah, and I thought that was really cool that he did that. What happened last year, nobody wants to see that type of damage to a city. Nobody wants to see what happened with George Floyd. Nobody wants that to happen. There was a lot of anger last year. I think there's still a lot of anger. Being here, it was a little tense in the beginning when I came over. There's a lot of anticipation. The crowd was hopeful for guilty verdicts on all 3 counts, but I did hear people kind of saying in the crowd, not guilty verdict, going to be incredibly upset, and they were very angry. And I'm getting kind of pushed out of the way for something. I'm not sure. Oh, it looks like there's going to be a press conference going on here in just a minute.
No, Angela, but thank you. Thank you so very much. Next time we talk, I'm going to get your
let me get over to this press conference, okay?
Yeah, next time we talk, I'm going to give you a reaction for the verdict. Okay, we're going to take a quick break now, I believe. Okay? All right. So I want you to stay with me, because on the other side, we'll have more exclusive information from the Law&Crime Network, and I'll be discussing with the verdict with my guests. Guilty, all 3 counts. George Floyd, and George Floyd, you are giving your life for maybe something bigger.